Welcome viewers. So as you're already aware, in this series we have been talking about different theories of error, and in that series we would be talking about yet another theory of error, namely akhyati. And this theory is propounded by one of the sub-schools of Mimamsa, namely Prabhakara's. So as we are already aware that Mimamsa school is broadly divided into two sort of different sub-schools. One is Purv Mimamsa and the other is Uttar Mimamsa. And in Uttar Mimamsa, as we are already aware that sort of in Uttar Mimamsa, dominantly when we talk about Uttar Mimamsa, we are talking about the Acharya tradition. So, and whose focus has been mainly on the Upanishadic texts, and they sort of most of these acharyas, including Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Nimbarkacharya, and so on. There have been an array of such acharyas, most of who were writing commentaries on different Upanishads, and were trying to glean out some kind of a systematic philosophy out of different Upanishads. That are there, because Upanishads are written, as we are, as many of us would know, Upanishads are written in a very different style. Their format is very different. So there are sort of stories told there. There are dialogues, sort of among different philosophers, and the way of propounding a kind of idea about certain metaphysical sort of issue or certain philosophical issue is very different there. So most of these acharyas were engaged in trying to give a systematic, try to kind of glean out a systematic philosophical account, which would be in tune with the way philosophizations, philosophical reflections at that time were done. Say, for example, during the time that most of these acharyas were writing, was the period of sutras, when that's a particular style of writing, a particular style of textual reflection was in vogue. And so to cut the discussion short on this issue, and then coming back to sort of the school that we're going to talk about, namely Mimamsakas. So this was about Uttar Mimamsa, but Purv Mimamsa also is divided into two different sub-schools, namely Bhattas and Prabhakaras. And there are very subtle differences, though both of them more or less adhere to the main Mimamsakas principles. But there are very subtle differences about which we have spoken in some of our earlier lectures, and we'll be talking in more detail about their epistemology and their and the kind of different pramanas they recognize within their systems. But that we'll do in some later lectures. So today we would be focusing on Prabhakaras, which is a sub-school of Purva Mimamsa. And they have some important points of divergences, when we compare them with Bhattas, which includes their theory of error. So we would talk about Bhatta's account of error in a separate lecture. But today we want to sort of focus our discussion on Prabhakara's theory of error. Now, in that context, we must understand, first of all, we must try and understand, what happens when a knowledge episode occurs. So, talking about in very commonsensical terms, most of us would agree that when we talk about some kind of an instance of knowledge or a knowledge episode, it mostly involves some kind of some object of cognition, and there is a knower who cognizes a particular object that we may be talking about. Now, from the point of view of cognition, from the point of view of sort of cognitive episode, it sort of it sort of is easy to see that there is no problem as far as the presentation of the object is concerned. So, in any given knowledge situation, in any given knowledge instance. Especially when we are talking about, errors, we are talking about objects which are mistaken as what they are not, wherein we cognize them as something which doesn't really tally with their actual nature. So, we talk about cognitions of objects which are external to us. So now, since in errors we form judgments about some objects which are external to us, or at least we so express them in our judgments, because even idealists would agree. They may agree that the givenness of the object is entirely in terms of ideas. So therefore, they are nothing more than ideas. But they would also agree that the givenness of the object, or our judgment, is of such a kind that it seems, it sort of expresses as if the object were outside of it, as if object it sort of so to speak exists independently. So at least the character of the judgment appears to be so. Now, given that to be the case, we must understand here that in any knowledge instance, there is some kind of givenness of an object before us, and then from our subjective side we form a judgment about it. Now, it stands to reason that there cannot be any problem as far as in the presentation of the judgment, or the presentation of the object is concerned. So, especially if you're a realist, this is this is how you would want to believe. This is what you would maintain about it. Though, if you're if you are a realist, if you are an idealist, even though you may want to say that even if you want to explain away judgment entirely in terms of ideas, you still need to explain how there is some kind of an externality in the experience of the object, because it's given to us. How come that externality of the object is part of its givenness to us? So now Prabhakara, being a realist, is tries to would try to escape any kind of idealism, and they Prabhakaras try to maintain that in errors, in situation of errors, what happens is that on the one hand we have presentation of an object, and on the other hand, we have this subjective, so to speak, registration of the object. I mean, this point we need to get clear about. So, the idea that we want to understand here is that in any knowledge episode, there are these kind of two contributions that kind of come together. One is the objective side, where the object is presented to us. Object is is given to us in some way, and then we form. And the subjective side is that after we have the givenness of the object, presentation of the object to us, we form a certain judgment about it. That's the subjective side, that this is something that we do as a subject. Now, so if you're a realist, you wouldn't want to say that there could be anything wrong with the givenness of the object, because in that case, there wouldn't be any it would be very difficult to account for the consistency of the universe. So we want to believe that there is nothing wrong. Chair is being an object is not hiding anything about itself. Chair gives itself to us in presentation in its entirety. There may not be anything wrong with the givenness. If we are a realist, world is as it is. World is not trying to sort of hide its nature from us. It is going about itself as it actually is. So any realist wouldn't want to counter the problem from that side. But if we want to counter the problem from the subjective side and say that the problem is entirely with how we see an object, then we sort of are trying to provide some kind of a leeway to the idealist, and a realist wouldn't want to do that. In our past few lectures, we have already seen how sort of different idealists look at the issue of error in different ways. And sort of their main questions are regarding the content of the judgment, and sort of the presentation of the object is not so much of an issue for them. So all the question is the substantial basis of the cognition, since we can never account for it. So therefore, they would, they are happy to explain it completely in subjective terms. But a realist, wouldn't want to do that either, because that sort of being a realist, it's incumbent upon the realist to explain why judgment of a certain kind happens, which is not in congruence, which is not in tune with the actual nature of the object. Since there should be a match between the two, the realist would require to sort of explain how come something being not there happens to be cognized. Because if something could be cognized despite its being not there, as one can very clearly see here, it provides a kind of it provides ample ground for an idealist to construct his or her philosophy from here. So therefore, a realist would never, maintain that something could be perceived without its being there, because it is tantamount to moving towards it is tantamount to making a move towards idealism. So Prabhakara takes a very unique stand within this equation. So what Prabhakara does is that Prabhakara states that there is nothing wrong with the givenness of the object, and also there is nothing wrong with our judgment. It's just that these are two parallel things happening, and there is no connection between the two. There is an entire gap between the two. And since there is no connection between the two, since these are two sort of parallel lines running adjacent to each other, but which are never going to meet anywhere, there is no point of transaction between them, what we do is we omit to see the gap between the two. So it's an act of omission. It doesn't require any kind of an explaining to be done, either from the point of view of the object, because there can be nothing wrong with the givenness of it, nor does it require any explanation on the part of the subject. You don't require any kind of psychological account of it, because given in itself, the judgment, say for example in the case of nacre being viewed as silver, there is nothing independently in the silver that we happen to cognize. The only issue is that it's a remembered silver. But independently, as the case of remembrance, it is valid because. But the point is that if we look at it as remembered silver, so within the act of cognition through remembrance, there is nothing wrong. So there is nothing wrong either in the presentation of the object, nor is there any problem with the remembered silver, cognition of which happens inside our mind. Both these cognitions are independently correct. Only problem is that we should know the difference between the two. A correct judgment in this situation would be tantamount to knowing that these are two separate judgments. The correct judgment, would be to know that there is this one judgment and there is another one. And the two are different, also knowing the differential between the two. So what goes amiss in an erroneous cognition is that we lose sight of this differential between the two cognitions. So this is in a nutshell, in a very sort of small nutshell, what Prabhakaras have to say about error. But before we go on to look at Prabhakara's view of error, we must first of all know a little bit of a background of it. First of all, we'll talk about where do we find references to this theory. Then we'll talk about how what Prabhakaras have to say about error is a natural offshoot from their epistemological position. So first of all, we need to understand that some of the Jaina scriptures about which we've talked earlier, many of the Jaina scriptures are there which talk elaborately in detail about different theories of error, many of which we have taken up for discussion in some of our previous lectures. So the term akhyati is used in a different way there. So since many of the idealists would be inclined to say that since everything is basically everything, any cognition basically is presented to us only in terms of ideas, and that being the case, then there is sort of nothing to explain. Only thing that needs to be explained is that one of the major objections that they'll have to give answer to is that there has to be some consistency. It shouldn't be that any ideas should be occurring to us for no reason at all. Ideas should occur to us for a reason. And the moment we talk about reason, then one of the most viable thing to do when you're explaining the reasons why you have ideas is only consistent explanation can be given in terms of externality of the world that is represented in the ideas. So, but idealists, since they are not their position, their philosophical position doesn't allow them to do that. Therefore, they would resort to how our consciousness works, how our mind works, what are what are the independent forces that are operative, when we are having different, so to speak, cognitions. When we are having different ideas in mind, so to speak, since all cognitions are only ideas for them, and to understand that, one can look into some of the Buddhist Yogacara idealist works, including Trinshika by Vasubandhus and Asanga and a whole lot of these philosophers, explain why certain, how consciousness has different layers, and there are, undercurrents, and because of those undercurrents, on the surface, certain kind of sort of ideas start start getting thrown into relief, which make their appearance before us. So, but that thing apart, though the term Akhyati is used for some of these theories by some of the Jaina writers, we are not talking presently about their theory, and dominantly Prabhakara's, this term is sort of most dominantly used for Prabhakara's theory of error. And their view of error is found in a commentary called Brahanti on Shabara Bhashya. Prakaran Panchika is another important work of Prabhakara school, which elaborately discusses the doctrine of error. Before discussing error, but before we go on to sort of actual discussion of error, we must discuss the theory of knowledge of Prabhakara, which resembles in more than one respect to the Nyaya school of Indian philosophy. So first of all, we need to understand that for Mimamsakas, any knowledge episode. First of all, there's this. There are these two different theories regarding validity of knowledge. So, according to Prabhakara Mimamsakas, any piece of knowledge is self-validated. It should be taken in the first instance as valid unless proven otherwise. So this theory is called Swata Pramanyavad. So according to this, any cognition should be taken as valid until and unless certain other reasons are sort of provided to us. So any knowledge is self-validated. It does not require any extraneous reasons for it to be validated. And the reason for the broad reason for assuming this position is that ultimately both the schools of Mimamsakas, both the school of Mimamsa, including Bhatta's and Prabhakara's, their ultimate aim is to preserve the authority of the Vedas, and since the Vedic knowledge comes along with its own authority, we'll have to believe that the truth that we require of knowledge is intrinsic to the Vedic knowledge, because the moment we say that it is validated for some other reason, then we can see that the authority of the Vedas would be undermined the moment we do that. So, the moment we validate, the statements of the Vedas through something external to the Vedas, then the authority of the Vedas, the truth ingrained supposedly in the Vedas, would become contingent on the extraneous authority through which it would then be validated. So, therefore, Mimamsakas would be unwilling to grant that that knowledge requires validation from some extraneous, from a point which is extraneous to the knowledge situation. So this position, according to which a piece of knowledge is self-validated, any instance of knowledge is self-validated, is something that we call Swata Pramanyavad. Whereas, according to Pratya Pramanyavad, any piece of knowledge requires extrinsic validation. We sort of act upon it, which is called sort of pravritti. So when we recognize something, it prompts some kind of an activity in us, pravritti in us, and if that results in success, unfrustrated activity, something called pravritti safalya, then that certifies the truth of that cognition. And further on, knowledge, is known by itself. It's self-luminous. It illuminates itself. This is, this is called Tripati Jnana, the doctrine of Tripati Jnana, proposed by Prabhakaras. So, according to Prabhakaras, knowledge act enlightens itself, knows the object, enlightens the object, and also enlightens the subject. So, as we can very clearly see here, the epistemology proposed by Prabhakaras is knowledge-centric in nature. Knowledge sort of, comes along with its own authority. It's there at the center, and sort of, it's not even, so to speak, in a certain way contingent upon conditions associated with the knower. So it's like in a certain way, it's absolute, doesn't require anything apart from itself to enlighten it. In that sense, it's completely independent, and it's self-luminous. So and this is in opposition to Nyaya, according to who. It requires a second order awareness in order to know. To know that I know requires a second order awareness, not that knowledge sort of makes itself known by itself. And similarly, Bhattas would say that we infer it back, because knowledge only leaves its mark on the object, namely gyatata, knownness. A known object looks different from an unknown object, and therefore, since when we know an object, we know that it is known. Therefore, we infer back that subject must have known it. Now, why are we discussing it in such detail? Because it has very important consequence upon Prabhakara's theory of error. Because if one believes that knowledge is an independent episode, so to speak, which enlightens itself, which enlightens the object, and which enlightens the subject, if its nature is like this, then any knowledge instance will have to be not only self-validated, will come along with its own truth. It is self-validated. It's sort of, since it's enlightening itself, it's independent. It's independent for its being known, so to speak. It's independent of anything. So, since it's knowledge is sort of self-explanatory, self-luminous, self-known, therefore, we cannot, properly speaking, account for its falsity. In that case, it can never be wrong. That would mean any cognition by itself would be true, as Prabhakaras actually say is the case. So they say, which sort of follows from their definition of knowledge, which follows from how they view the nature of knowledge. It naturally follows that any knowledge would be self-validated, and if that is the case, then any cognition, since it carries its own truth, since it is independent of anything for its truth, therefore any cognition would be true, and there is no way to talk about falsity of cognition. Now, this is where the problem for Prabhakaras come, as far as the error theory is concerned, because according to their epistemological stance, there is no room for falsity of cognition. There is no room for invalidity of cognition. And given that to be the case, they'll have to explain why it so happens that our judgments are contradicted later on by another judgment, or they are contradicted through the activity that we perform upon the object. We act upon an object thinking that it is of a certain nature, but when we sort of perform the pravritti, when we sort of perform that action, the object doesn't respond likewise, and which and this mismatch is what we call error. This mismatch is entirely what makes a cognition erroneous in nature. Now, since we just can't say that errors don't happen because it's a given fact. Therefore, given a very different kind, very unique epistemological stand that Prabhakara's take, one would be curious to know how they would explain an erroneous cognition from within their epistemological framework. So, Naiyayikas and Prabhakaras both believe that knowledge is distinct from the self in which it arises. Though it is different, it can belong only to the self and therefore become a characteristic feature, Vishesh Guna, of it. This far, the view is same as to the Naiyayikas. So both of them believe that knowledge is an adventitious quality, is an adventitious property of the self. So both Naiyayikas and Prabhakaras wouldn't have any problem about that. But knowledge, here is conceived not as knowable. For Prabhakaras, knowledge is not conceived as knowable in the sense of prameya. It is not an object of knowledge. Then how it is known? It is self-luminous. It's not a prameya. It illuminates itself. And it accordingly reveals not only the object to which it refers, but also itself. So as we talked about Tripati, Jnana theory, it enlightens all these three things together, object, itself, and the subject. So there is centrality of the knowledge episode in Prabhakaras and not the self. Their epistemology in that sense is not subject-centric but knowledge-centric. But then if knowledge is self-explanatory, is self-illumined, then unlike idealists, one cannot resort to the role of the subject in the erroneous cognition. So these are the main issues as far as Prabhakara's epistemology is concerned. And given their epistemology, it seems that it would be difficult for them to explain a case of error. Because the judgment, the erroneous cognition, in an erroneous cognition, the judgment that we form, since it's based on a cognition, and all cognition are independently true. Therefore, there is no reason, one is at a loss of understanding how, from this point of view, we could explain error. So, the problem here is that one could argue, given this position assumed by Prabhakara Mimamsakas, one could argue if all apprehensions are valid, then there is no criteria to distinguish between truth and falsity. So Prabhakara's answer to it would be, so far as the element of apprehension is concerned, all the so-called invalid instances of knowledge, all the instances of invalid knowledge rather, is also valid, while the element that is invalid is tantamount to no apprehension at all. So as explained earlier, the point of view is that in a situation of error, there are two cognitions occurring. When we say this is silver, when we are actually seeing, a piece of oyster shell or nacre as it's popularly called, and we think of it, we judge it in our judgment, we think of it as silver, then what's happening is that the judgment that is formed is this is silver. Now, in this judgment, the term this refers to the nacre, the oyster shell, and silver is somehow predicated to it. Now, the way Mimamsaka Prabhakaras look at it is that, see, these are two parallel judgments. How is silver cognized? How does cognition of silver arise? According to them, this happens because of what is called smriti pramosha, confused memory. So what happens is there are certain qualities which in generality the given object, namely here neka, shares with the silver, namely its shining, its particular kind of sort of color, its shine. And because and that sort of makes us remember silver. So that leads to an episode of remembrance of silver. So what is happening here is this, when we say this is silver, this, the element of cognition of this is valid in its own right, because this refers to the presentation, the givenness of the object. And there is no problem with the givenness of the object, because the object, namely neka, is presenting itself as it actually is. So in that part there is independently no problem. That cognition is valid by itself. And remembered silver, the cognition of remembered silver, that episode is also valid in itself. The problem is by, in associating the two, these are two parallel cognitions, but we bring them together by this auxiliary is. Now, is refers to, some would say, identification. It's a mark of identity, like thou art that. So one could express it as, defining identity between Brahman and Atman. But this, if we explain it this way, then it becomes even more difficult to explain error, though this is how Ramanuja explains error. We will come to that later. So in the judgment, this is silver, is does not refer to identity between the two. Is refers to a kind of sort of confusion that we create between these two independently valid cognitions. So what happens is refers to an act of, so to speak, forgetfulness. We do not differentiate between these two judgments. And when we don't differentiate, what happens is the gap between the two is not seen by us, which otherwise should be seen. So this is, this like quote unquote is, in the judgment, this is silver, is representative of an act of omission on our part. And what do we sort of omit? We omit to see the differential between these two different set of cognitions. Namely, thisness, which is the cognition of an object in its complete generality. We forget, we tend to ignore its vishesha guna. We only see its generality. And the second part is the remembered silver, and we omit to see that which differentiates between the two. So the difference, is not viewed by us. And this is what accounts for, so-called error. So according to them, actually, there is nothing positively happening. There is no identification being done between the two objects, between the two different cognitions. If there were some kind of misidentification, then it needs to be explained either from the subjective side or from the objective side. But according to Prabhakaras, nothing of that kind is happening here. This is not representative of anything positive. In this is silver, is doesn't represent any act of, any positive act of identifying the two. It only refers to the act of omission of cognizing the difference. So it's a matter of interpretation. They look at this, this copula is this auxiliary is, which associates these two cognitions, as not something positive, but as something negative. So instead of seeing the differential, which would then have amounted to is not, so that differential, that not part, is not seen by us. That results in sort of confused perception. So one could argue, if all apprehensions are valid, then there is no criteria to distinguish between truth and falsity. So in answer to that, we have already seen, so far Prabhakara say that so far as the element of apprehension is concerned, all the so-called invalid knowledge instances are also valid, while the element that is invalid is tantamount to no apprehension at all. No apprehension at all, as we just saw, it is tantamount to not apprehending the difference between the two. Prabhakaras further say that erroneous perception of a shell as silver, of a nacre as silver, is not a unitary cognition as maintained by the Nyaya. This is silver is a composite cognition made of two component parts. This part is actually perceived as also certain characteristics which it possesses in common with silver. The very presence of these characteristics revive in our mind the past memory traces, sanskara, of silver. It is a sort of confused memory called smriti pramosha. Error then is a mere accidental factor. So, since the subject fails to apprehend the difference between what has been presented by the object and what has been represented in memory. So it's an act of omission. Error involves, omitting to make the difference between the two. So it is, absence of apprehension. There are two different apprehensions happening. But along with that, there should have been ideally a third apprehension, namely that of difference between the two, which is, sort of a kind of a logical necessity. That third apprehension is missing. That's the only thing which we generally call as error. So error, according to them, occur because of non-discrimination, which means non-apprehension of the distinction between two cognitions and their objects. And this is also the reason why akhyati is also elsewhere described as viveka khyati or bhedagraha, meaning not seeing the bheda, agraha meaning sort of grahan of bheda, meaning reception of bheda, reception of difference, cognition of difference doesn't happen, so signified by the prefix a. So, when there is a graha of bheda, then error occurs. This is also known as asansarga graha, not seeing of, confusing of the two different cognitions. Omitting to see sort of how we are conflating two different judgments. So again, the emphasis is upon not non-apprehension. This is why it's called agraha, asansarga graha. So errors are mix of are mix of two cognitions, and not ek gyano paroha. So it's not that it's a unitary judgment. It's not eka jnana, but it is two different separate cognitions. It's not a single act. This is what is very distinctive about Prabhakara theory. Now let's sort of quickly look at some of the objections that one could have against this theory of error or khyati proposed by Prabhakaras. Now, one could argue that Prabhakaras cannot explain that error is caused. If it is akhyati, as they try to explain, then causality of the erroneous cognition is not explained. Non-discrimination, since it is occasioned, must have a cause, or it should happen all the time. So the problem with this theory is, since there is no positive act, according to them, error is doesn't involve any positive act. But then, in that case, the reason for error is not explained, in the sense that the moment we start to explain the reasons why this happens, we'll have to go outside the knowledge instance. So why does it so happen that we happen to non-differentiate between the two? That needs to be explained. And the moment you are saying, one says that it happens because of similarity and so on, then again, then you are going a little beyond. Then you're going kind of towards the subjective side. As a matter of fact, an act of omission is also something that requires it to be attributed to something. It cannot happen by itself. So reason could lie in the subject. There could be some problem with the subject. Say, for example, being extremely casual, being extremely forgetful, somebody not giving enough attention to details. All these could be different reasons. Then in that case, again, then you are resorting to the certain sort of subjectivism. Then you're resorting to some kind of idealism, because you're explaining in that case, explaining it in terms of subjective perception of it. So this is one of the problems that could be raised against Prabhakaras. The Naiyayikas argue against Prabhakaras. With this spelling mistake, they argue against the Prabhakaras that this theory of error fails to account for the presentative character in illusion. Because the judgment, Naiyayikas as opposed to Prabhakaras would believe there is a single unitary judgment which involves conflating, it's a single judgment which involves confusing two different things. So since it happens as if it were resulting from a single act of perception, so Naiyayikas think that a realist should rather explain it through perception, rather than resorting to something, rather explaining it in negative terms. Because there is in illusion also there is this presentative character which is something positive, and a realist needs to explain that. And Prabhakaras do not, according to them, appropriately account for the presentative character in the single unitary judgment. This is silver. Silver appears, even if we want to say appears, mistakenly appears, whichever way, but it has a kind of a presentative character. Silver appears as if presented to us. So this presentative character, this character of presentation, needs to be explained. So for Naiyayikas, it happens through extrasensory perception. So they say this perception actually occurs. Silver is actually perceived through an extrasensory perception, like Sugandhi Pushpam. Like at times when we see a flower, we think of it. Sorry. Even when we know that we are not perceiving its fragrance at that moment, we know it to be fragrant. Sorry. Again, Prabhakar holds that in the illusion, this is silver. Two types of consciousness are present. Two types of apprehensions occur, namely the apprehension and remembrance. Sorry. But this is silver, but they are revealed by the same consciousness. But in the judgment, this is silver, it seems to be the same sort of a unitary piece of consciousness. So there is no reason to hold that the consciousness of this is an act of perception and the predicate is an act of remembrance. And in this position, if this is the position we take to explain error, it's difficult to present an account of why a person, if this not an act of it's not a positive act of making a judgment, then, and if silver is not is not something that's presented to us, but it's remembered silver, then how can it happen that remembered silver could prompt us, could prompt us into action, could cause a pravritti in us? That is done only if there is presentative character or that sort of comes along in the cognition of an object. So in the case of remembered silver, we would never want to go and procure that piece of silver. But when we say this is silver, where according to Mimamsakas, this silver part is remembered silver. But if that is the case, remembered silver cannot prompt us into activity. Nobody would say, well, I was remembering some silver and I'm thinking I should go and take it. Nobody would meaningfully talk like this. So if in judgment this is silver, silver is the remembered silver, it cannot explain how through that judgment this is silver, we are prompted to action to go and procure it. So one acts on the basis of experience or knowledge. The mere absence of a discriminating knowledge between two experiences, being itself something negative, can by no means provoke positive activity. Something that is negative in character cannot prompt a positive activity in us. Prabhakaras further fail to explain how remembered cognition is amalgamated with the present fact and present itself as unitary act of perception. Naiyayikas explain it much more convincingly with their theory of Jnana Lakshana Pratyaksha. Prabhakara is right in pointing out that in illusion there is some objective fact which is but viewed incompletely. So Prabhakara is also explain, because they cannot deny that when we form the judgment this is silver, there is some kind of a conflation, there's some kind of a confusion, amalgamation, mixing up of two different judgments happening here. What is the reason for this mix-up? That needs to be explained. And the moment one attempts to do that, one either takes the idealist line or one takes the realist line. One cannot avoid doing both. So Prabhakaras seem to be more in favor of avoiding the problem by calling it a negative act of failing to see the differential between the two cognitions, rather than actually giving a positive explanation for it. So Prabhakaras are right in pointing out that in illusion there is some objective fact which is but viewed incompletely, and there is the memory image revived due to similarity, but it fails to explain how the memory image is synthesized or fused with the given fact. How the two come together, get synthesized, get amalgamated. Whereas, in Nyaya theory, this point is explained with the help of Jnana Lakshana Pratyaksha, which is not acceptable to Mimamsakas. Mimamsakas, do not believe in extrasensory perception. So, they don't have that option, as a matter of fact, available to them, because Vedas are storehouse of knowledge of a kind which is not available through perception. Something for which perception is available, we don't would require information for that in the Vedas. So Vedic knowledge is entirely about something that we cannot perceive. It's about soul, it's about the ultimate reality, it's about cosmic law, which don't lend themselves, all these things don't lend themselves to perception. But if we allow extrasensory perception and allow that these things could be viewed by extrasensory perception, then their position is undermined. So therefore, we find that Prabhakara Mimamsaka's theory of error is completely tied up with their epistemological stand, and we also see there are certain kind of shortcomings in Prabhakara's theory which are better addressed by some of the other theories, namely Nyaya, or for that matter even Ramanuja. So that is it for now. In our future lectures we'll talk more about Nyaya and Ramanuja theory of error. Thank you.